Hi, everyone. It's Valerie King Maller, and I'm here with my co host, Callie Hughes, who's a nurse practitioner and also my business partner for Hello Glow. And tonight we are going to talk about meal planning, one of Callie's favorite topics. But welcome, Callie. And first off, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about gentle nutrition. We use that term a lot, and I'd love to hear just your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so gentle nutrition is the philosophy basically of eating in a way that's aligned with what your body needs and not forcing yourself to adhere to a specific prescribed meal plan or diet or anything like that. So, for example, gentle nutrition would be more like listening to my own body's cues for when I'm hungry, when I'm full, what I want to eat, like what I'm craving, what I don't want to eat, and just following those cues as opposed to eating a certain number of calories per day, eating according to macro limits. That kind of thing is sort of the opposite of gentle nutrition.
And I know that in some of our other discussions, you talked a little bit about the number scale when it comes to gentle nutrition and sort of a way to listen to your body. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the number scale is a way that I help my clients to understand their own body's natural hunger and satiety or fullness cues. So it goes on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being that you are starving to death, literally. And then 10 being that you are so overstuffed that you are nauseous and vomiting. So those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum. And obviously, we don't want to constantly be vacillating between 1s and 10s because then our lives would be pretty miserable. What we would rather have is for people to stay within a 3 to a 7 range. So a 3 is kind of where you are feeling hungry, but it's not to the point of being uncomfortable and you're not feeling that irritable, hangry feeling. And then up to 7 is where you are feeling comfortably full, but not overstuffed, and you're feeling satisfied. And usually the cue that I tell people to try to pay attention to when they're getting near a 7 is to pay attention to if the food starts sort of losing its appeal, because most people recognize at a certain point, if you're really hungry and you're eating a meal that you just absolutely love, at a certain point, you kind of don't have that same, strong reaction like you did to the first bite. And that's a cue that you're getting close to full. So that's a really good starting point for helping people recognize that.
Yeah. How do you have people start this process? Like, I think just for me, excuse me, it was really difficult to kind of get in the habit of sort of judging where I was on the scale at different times. Like, should someone set an alarm and be like, hey, I'm a 6 right now, I better I'm okay, I don't need to eat right away? Or is there kind of some steps to get into paying more attention to your body?
Yeah. So I would say that the best first step is to just start to pay attention to how you're feeling before, during, and after meals. Mm-hmm. You don't even have to really start trying to change anything, but just keeping the number scale in mind. Just give yourself a number before your meal, maybe when you're almost done with your meal, and then after, like maybe 15, 20 minutes after your meal. And that's going to help you start to recognize where your body's at and start to tune into those cues more. But one caveat is that if you have been chronically dieting for many, many years or decades, and you've been on strict diets, sometimes people are at the point where they're very divorced from their body's natural cues. And some people genuinely don't know what hunger or fullness feels like because they have been so conditioned over the years to only go by a calorie count or a macro count or what time it is, that kind of thing. And so for people who feel that they're kind of in that camp and they're not really able to tell what's full, what's hungry, what I usually recommend to them is to just start at the very, very, very beginning of doing the mindset work that you need to sort of have under your belt before you get too far into this process. So you need to start allowing all foods, change your mindset of there are healthy foods and unhealthy foods, and work on letting go of the judgments that you have around food, whether it's of the food itself or of you being the person eating the food and what that means for you. If you can start to let go of that, it helps your brain to kind of unlearn some of that old conditioning. And you will eventually get to the point where you are able to recognize and kind of put the pieces together of like, oh, this must be what hunger is, or this must be what being really full is without being uncomfortable. So that's kind of like a two-part answer, but people usually are coming from one of those two starting points.
I never even think of that, but that's like a really good point. Can you talk a little bit about how meal planning fits into the concept of gentle nutrition and what the benefits of meal planning are?
Yeah, so I think some people have the misconception that if you are meal planning, then it's not intuitive eating and it's not gentle nutrition. However, meal planning, the way that I teach it, is not the really restrictive, prescriptive system the way that diets are. So meal planning, the way that I instruct it and teach people, is basically just taking the meals that you or your family already know that you like and creating a system around that and systemizing it so that you aren't spending a ton of time every single day trying to figure out what's for dinner, figure out if you have the stuff for whatever you're in the mood for, and then prepping and cooking. That whole thing can be like a 2-hour process sometimes, and people just don't have the time or energy for that at the end of the long day. So the system that I teach people kind of helps to circumvent that so that you are able to eat nutrient dense foods with minimal time investment. And it just gives you like a loose framework to work off of throughout the week.
Have you found that it makes a difference with your budget and just also like food waste? Because I know that I have a problem with both of those. Has it made a difference, or do you feel like you're spending roughly the same amount of money and having the same amount of waste, or do you have it down to a science where you feel like you've accomplished both those things as well?
Yeah, at this point, since I've been doing this for long enough where I know the system, forwards and backwards, I'm at the point now where it definitely has cut down on what we're spending because we're not, going to the grocery store hungry and buying a whole bunch of stuff that maybe we're not going to eat, or maybe I thought was a good idea at the time. And then it just, rots in my fridge or goes bad in the cupboard. um, and it definitely has cut down on food waste. So one of the things that I recommend as part of my meal planning system is to plan according to what kinds of food you want to make. So, for instance, um, foods like carrots, broccoli, potatoes, things like that keep throughout the week. And so I usually recommend eating those at the end of the week before you go shopping again, and consuming the more perishable stuff like salads or the more fragile fruits and vegetables that go bad a lot faster earlier in the week. And that's just part of the system that I had to get used to. And it was one of those things that took me a little while to really kind of get the hang of remembering that as I'm planning my meals and thinking about things. But once you get to the point where you're able to factor that in easily, it definitely cuts down on cost and food waste. And it cuts way back on the time that I spend thinking about meals and trying to get them ready.
Yeah. Speaking of that, can you take us through your typical meal planning week? Do you do like a Sunday thing where you're planning for most of the week, or do you have multiple days that you're planning just a few days ahead? Maybe just take us through kind of a typical week for yourself.
Sure. So, what I tend to do is I meal plan a week at a time, and I grocery shop and meal prep for about a week at a time.
Mhm.
Sometimes, depending on what the food is, I might prep for just a couple of days and then prep again, like on a Wednesday night or afternoon or something for the rest of the week if something might go bad. But basically, the process is first step to set yourself up. And that includes coming up with meal categories so that you kind of have a jumping off point when you're thinking of what recipes to cook. You want to create a template of your grocery list so that you're not reinventing the wheel every week. That has the staples. So for breakfast, lunch, snacks, usually those are more or less the same types of things. And then you want to set up a system where you're keeping a running grocery list for things that are running low or expired. And that's going to help you just stay organized. So that's step one, is just to like set up your system. Step two is to meal plan. So you just sit down with your meal categories. So for instance, for my household, we have like a meatless Monday category, Mexican, have a night where we have pasta or red meat, is something we don't eat, but, a lot of other people do. So you can have like a beef night, a chicken night, a pork night, a meatless night, maybe like, and then some cuisines that you guys really like to eat. So like maybe Mexican or Italian or something like that. And so that's 7 nights. You can even throw in, if you're like me, a frozen pizza night or or a takeout night to keep it realistic. So you just want to meal plan and take your categories and fill in a recipe that your family already enjoys. And then you're done with that step. Then once you're done with dinner, then you can move on and just write down what your family eats for breakfast, what you're going to need for lunches, and what you're going to need for snacks.
Mm-hmm.
Then you just want to add anything from the recipes that you don't have onto your grocery list, which will already have your staple items on it. So you don't have to really worry about that piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then after you go grocery shopping and bring your food home, I usually recommend blocking out 90 minutes to start, but at least 60 minutes to get your meal prepping completed.
Mm-hmm.
So the prepping system is kind of its own thing, but basically you'd want to start with your vegetables. If you're making any salads or dishes that include roasted veggies later in the week, you can roast things ahead of time and just keep them in the fridge to reheat later when you're making that recipe. So roasting first, and then you just cut up all the other vegetables. And I recommend storing them into their own containers according to when you're going to eat them.
Mm-hmm.
Then you want to move on to any fruits and then meat after that. You want to keep the meat towards the end because you don't want to have any cross-contamination issues with the raw fruits or vegetables. As far as the meat goes, you can cook ahead anything that you aren't going to need to cook fresh. So like diced chicken or something that's going to be added into a recipe, you can definitely cook that ahead of time and just keep it in a Tupperware. So do that, cook the meat you want to cook, or just chop it up and leave it raw in a Tupperware, put that in the fridge. And then once that's all done, you can just make the snacks and stuff into portions if you want to be like extra prepared for anything. And that's it. That's the whole meal planning and meal prepping system. It's
really cool.
Really simple in concept, but it's kind of interesting because putting it into practice, it seems much more, especially as you're starting. But I recommend to people that you try to stick with it for at least a month. And that allows you time to get used to it and to create your own little shortcuts with the system that are going to work for you. And 9 times out of 10, people continue with it because it does work for most people.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that makes so much sense because I am someone that definitely stops doing it after a week and thinks it doesn't work. But I do think that there's some really good concepts there. Do you do anything where you're kind of taking leftovers from the night before for lunch, or like how do you tackle sort of the different meals in a day so that there isn't waste and so that you're kind of capitalizing on the pre-planning ahead of time?
So what I've been doing, it kind of depends on personal preference, but personally, I like a hot lunch, and my husband doesn't really care. Like he'll take a cold sandwich or something like that, and he's happy with it. So usually the way that it ends up working out is there will be 1 to maybe 2 portions of leftovers every night because we always cook a little bit more than we expect to eat so that we have leftovers. And I'll eat those for lunch. And so I factor that into the meal planning. And then I also plan for some deli meat or something for my husband's lunches. So that's another really good way to save time and save some money also, is just by cooking, an extra half a recipe or doubling the recipe so that you can have some leftovers and then maybe freeze some for a night where you're running behind.
I was literally going to say that that's my favorite trick. I'm not very great at the meal planning, but my favorite thing is the freezing stuff, because there are nights when you're like, I just have to throw this in the oven. Like, I don't want to do anything else, any prep. So that's great. Let's talk kids and how they factor into the whole meal planning. How do you encourage children to get involved? And also, how does it work with kids, like when you are meal planning?
So kids, depending on the age, younger kids are obviously not going to be a huge help with the meal planning piece, but older kids are able to help with, deciding a certain meal that they want the family to make on a specific night of the week, or helping to go shopping. And that might be a good budgeting and planning lesson for them. So depending on the age, they can get involved with the planning piece. And then as far as prepping goes, my kids really like to prep the fruit because it turns into a bit of an impromptu snack for them and it just keeps them busy. So what I do is I have them set up, and one thing that I will say, I suppose, is factor in extra time if your kids are helping you so that you don't feel time crunched and get frustrated, because you really want to make this a positive experience for your kids, and you don't want them to associate it with being rushed or yelled at or, told,
Great point.
oh, you're doing it too slow. Come on, we're running late. Let me just do this. You really want to kind of set yourself up for success by factoring in extra time. Like, instead of 90 minutes, maybe just make it 2 hours, just so that you have a cushion. And I recommend that you get your kids their own cutting board and a kid's knife set. They have a bunch of different options on Amazon, but there are kids' knives that don't have an actual blade, and it's just like serrated plastic, basically. So it's less of a hazard. But just get them involved with chopping or, helping at the stove if they're old enough to do that. And you can really wrap in some good memories as a family, but also get them used to the idea of cooking for themselves, chopping up vegetables to eat. And I will also say that kids are much more likely to eat food that they have helped prepare. So if you have a picky eater on your hands, this might be a really good way to help expand their palate a little bit and make them a little bit more adventurous and want to try new things.
Yeah. I was just going to ask, I know you have 2 little kids, how you do deal with picky eating, especially if you have a pre-planned meal that you've prepped for and they're sort of freaking out about not wanting to eat it. Do you have any recommendations for sort of how to either stop that ahead of time or factor that in when you're meal planning?
Yeah. So this is something that is a universal issue. And it comes up a lot more if your kid happens to be a picky eater, but all kids refuse to eat food at some point, regardless of their age. So this is actually a really good topic. And it's a question that gets brought up a lot, actually, because people have heard that you don't want to force your kid to eat all the food on their plate. And you don't want to, also people don't want to be making be a cook for, gourmet meals for a different member of their family every night, So how can you kind of meet in the middle while not creating a bad relationship between your kid and food? So here's my answer to that. You want to, yes, avoid telling your kid that they need to clean their plate, because that will encourage them to not listen to their internal cues for when they're full and judge when they're done eating by how much food is left on their plate. So that's not a helpful habit to start with them. So let them finish eating whenever they say that they're done. And if you are making a meal that might be a new recipe, try making sure that there is something on the table that your kid will eat, that you know that they like, and then just kind of let them do their thing. If there's something that you know that they like, they're just, worst case scenario is they're just going to eat that and they're not going to go to bed hungry. And even if they, so, okay, this is the other thing, like real talk. So my 5-year-old is my picky eater, and it's a relatively new thing over the last year or so. And there have been nights, because you know how kids are, they're fickle, and something they liked yesterday, it's something they hate today. So there have been some nights where she's refused to eat anything that's on the table. And so there have been times where, like, I'm not going to fall into the trap of being a short order cook. And so I'm like, well, this is what's for dinner. I know that you've said that you like, rolls or whatever it might be. You can choose to eat this, or you can choose not to eat. It's totally fine, and it's up to you. And sometimes she'll eat, sometimes she won't. But the other thing is that I don't let them get up from the table until everyone is done eating, or until most people are finished eating. And oftentimes, if they're sitting with me and my husband and we're eating, they will eat a little bit more too. So those are some little workarounds. And in case anybody's wondering, like, I do not send my daughter to bed hungry. I give her, usually after dinner, I'll give her a cheese stick or something like that. But her general routine seems to be eating a lot in the morning and then not eating a huge dinner or anything in the evening. So you also have to understand that kids sometimes develop that kind of a rhythm, and it's like, don't make dinner time any more painful for yourself than it has to be. Like, just go with it.
You also mentioned something that I thought was really interesting, and we will link your PDF in the show notes, but about dessert and for kids after. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
So yeah, dessert. A lot of people use dessert as a reward with their kids. And I will admit that it is really easy to fall into that. I've caught myself several times doing that, because that's just how I was raised too. And so it's just one of those deep ingrained habits. But a lot of people will say, you can't have dessert until you have eaten X, Y, and Z, or if you have cleaned your plate, or, that kind of a thing. And that also creates this association in a kid's brain that certain foods are higher up on the value scale than others. So it kind of puts desserts and sweet foods on a pedestal and makes them more desirable than they would have been otherwise. Because, kids, it's like once you tell them that they can't have something, that's what they want.
Mm-hmm.
And so my recommendation with that is to, if you know that you're going to be having a dessert, after the meal or something, if it, say for instance, like you have a pie and it's like a family dinner and there's pie for dessert, it might not make sense to have pie on the table, so that the kids can eat that if they want, but not putting conditions on it, not being like, well, you didn't eat your dinner, so you don't get dessert. If they want the pie, let them have the pie. And other people feel comfortable, like if you're having, say, cookies or something for dessert, putting the cookies on the table along with all of the other dinner food. And that way kids can see that all of these foods are okay to eat. It's not a bad thing if I take 2 cookies or if I take 2 servings of, salad. It's all valued the same. And so that helps to avoid those seedlings of a binge relationship with those highly bingeable foods, desserts and snacks and that kind of a thing.
Yeah, that's really like fascinating. I never thought of that, but that is a really good way to sort of condition them to or just set them up for more intuitive eating in the future. And I just really love that. So as I mentioned, we'll link your PDF on meal planning in the show notes, but is there anything else that you think is really important for people to know about the meal planning process?
Well, the only other thing I would say is just to be flexible and don't make yourself feel like this is a hard and fast plan or program. And if you veer off course, then you've screwed up your entire week. That's the all or nothing kind of thinking that we really want to stay away from. And if something comes up, because life happens, if something comes up and you find when you're kind of evaluating from the week prior and planning for the week ahead that something didn't work or something weird came up and changed things, it just is a learning experience for you. And it'll just help you to kind of keep something, whatever it might be, in mind going forward, and you can make the changes you need to. So just be flexible. Think of this as a lifestyle change. Like it's not a program and it's not something that you can succeed or fail at. It's just a habit that's going to save you time and money and effort. And you just take what works for you and leave the rest.
That's great. Well, thank you so much to Callie Hughes, whose passion is definitely intuitive eating and gentle nutrition. So it was really great to talk to you. And if you guys have any questions for us, you can always email us at helloglowchallenge@gmail.com. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.